lovely to see you all here. I'm just going to open with a karakia. He honore, he kororia, ki te atua. He mauna rongo ki te whenua. He whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hanga e te atua hi ngā ko ho ki roto, ki tina e mato. Whakatonia ti wairua tapu. He awhina, he tahu tohu, he ia mato, he ako hoki I ngā mahi mō tēnai rā. Amen. Welcome to a Bail here presents. It's lovely to have you all here. Our intention this year is to make them a little bit more regular. For some various reasons last year they became a little less regular, but we're going to try and make them a little bit more regular, but also have options, and Shah will share that with us a bit more at the end so that there's different ways of connecting. If you've got ideas of things that you'd love us to talk about, we'd love to hear from you, particularly if you've got an exciting something that you want to share as well. We're really open to hearing ideas. So I'm Rachelle Martin, and I am one of the researchers here at the Burwood Academy. I'm going to give you the safety briefing now. So toilets is the first safety briefing. Toilets are just like go out the door, turn right, and you'll see the sign. If you want water, if you go out the door, turn right, and then veer left, you'll see a kitchen. You must eat cake, because otherwise it's a safety issue for the Bail staff. You have to eat all the leftover cake. That's the other thing. And there's also an emergency exit. If you head out that way, there are emergency stairs right down the far end as well if we get stuck, but we will support anyone who needs support to get out and away if there's a need. So I'm going to introduce Emily to you, Emily Timothy, and let her start off. Emily and I have got a bit of a Tom and Jerry show, sort of swapping over with each other. So you'll hear more from me, but I'll let Emily start at this point.
Thank you, Rachelle. Lovely to see you all. Nice to see some familiar faces, but also lots of new faces to me. So hopefully we'll get to know you all more over the coming months. So for those of you who don't know me, I am by trade a physiotherapist, and I usually work in the community stroke rehabilitation service, where I've been for the past 13 years. And it's a team I love, and I really enjoy being a physio. I particularly enjoy the privilege of going into people's homes and being part of an interdisciplinary team. But I also really enjoy research, and I've been dabbling in research over the past few years. I did my master's, and we did a workplace study a few years ago, and I've also done some research assistant work. So when this opportunity came up with Bail to be able to work with an amazing team with a wealth of expertise and knowledge and multiple projects going on and really well established and connected team, I thought I would jump at it. So today we're going to talk about one of the studies that Bail's doing at the moment, and that's all around early conversations about vocational aspirations for people with acquired neurological conditions, in particular people with spinal cord injuries and people after stroke. Before we go on to that though, I would like to just do a little advertising for the Health Research Council, who have made this opportunity for me possible. So anyone in the audience who might be interested in pursuing research, if you are interested in doing more, and in particular knowing how to access funding, the Health Research Council is a really great place to start. They offer a range of funding opportunities, and I've been granted the Career Development Award, which has enabled me to have a funded placement with Bail, and it's really aimed at attracting more people with relevant experience into the area. So if you are interested, have a chat to any of the team in Bail. There's always new opportunities, and it's great to hear about people's research ideas, and they're a great team who can support you in your own journey. Now, Rachelle and I are obviously speaking today, but we represent a large team of people who are working on this study, and this study is being led by Dr. Jennifer Dunn, who's really acknowledging all her work and the team around her. Okay, so we're going to start off with Rachelle's going to set the scene a little bit and talk a bit about knowledge translation, and then we'll go on to talk about the study, which is the early vocational services study, and then more specifically about the study that I am leading, and then finish up with some time for discussion. So we really value your opinions and thoughts, and I would like to put my disclaimer in at this point that I am not an expert, and particularly not an expert in vocational rehab or spinal cord injury rehab, so I really appreciate all the wealth of experience that you guys will have and will be able to give me guidance along the way.
Does everyone remember the initial peer support meetings way ages ago, when it was like people shared an idea and then everyone fed back in a very supportive manner? That's what we're aiming for today. So if you can just go back there, that would be really great, because we are keen to learn from you guys as well. So I really just wanted to set the stage for what this project is all about, because for us at Bale, research is only really meaningful when it leads to a change in the way things happen, the way things are delivered, the way services are experienced, the way that life is able to be lived. And so undergirding all of our work is this sort of focus on what we call an integrated knowledge translation sort of approach. And I'll keep coming back to it, but just to explain where it all fits and how this project came to be in. So we have kind of a mandate which helps us decide what we're going to focus on, and in the Burwood, the Bale world, our mandate is set by people with lived experience who say this is important to us, we want you to do research around these areas. And so certainly vocational and work-related outcomes and being able to live a meaningful life is something that was very important. Alongside that, MSD also we're looking at funding some solution development around improving low return to work rates for people following acquired brain injury, and specifically obviously those who aren't on ACC funding, so that there was this identified need and they were putting some money. So stars aligned, and with a lot of hard work, that's where the funding came from. So there's already a strong foundation for an impetus for change. And then the way we do research is kind of very much integrated. So we're trying very much to not be experts in the field, but to gather a group of people who understand the field and together create and co-construct meaning in the way that we design the research and in the way we do the research. And that involves ongoing relationships with a whole range of stakeholders. So stakeholders being the technical term for anyone who knows more about it than we do. And so we really want to bring together a team that can continually engage across the life of a project so that we can then come up with an outcome. We'll talk about it a bit more, but basically we're trying to design a service, and this EVocS stands for Early Intervention Vocational Rehabilitation. So an early intervention vocational service for people following ABI. So they were going to kind of design it and say what are the key aspects of that service and come up with a plan for how it could be implemented. We're not implementing it. We don't have the funding for that, but we're open. If you've got ideas for how we get that, we are very open to hearing them. And obviously we have to disseminate knowledge, and we have to do it with reports and presentations and publications and all that sort of thing. But as you can see, knowledge has been created and grown and developed through the whole process, rather than just in a sort of a final summation. So we're presenting today and where we're up to, but that's why we really want to hear your feedback of where we go next and sort of things that we might need to consider as we go along. So Emily's going to now just talk a little bit about the EVocS study as a whole and where it came from and what we're aiming to do.
I believe there's already been a presentation that Jen did sometime last year about about the EVocS study, but I'm just going to explain a bit more for those of you who've not heard about it. So there's always acronyms in research. It's the Early Vocational Rehabilitation Following Neurological Disability, or EVocS study for short. So I just want to spend a moment just defining some of those terms. So vocational rehab is defined as whatever helps someone with a health problem to stay at, return to and remain in work. It's an idea and an approach as much as an intervention or a service. Now the early part of that refers to vocational rehab services that commence early on after acquired disability, so often within those first few weeks of somebody being in hospital. So we are really fortunate that in New Zealand, and specifically in Burwood and Auckland, that we have such an early vocational rehab service. So the New Zealand Spinal Trust have set up this service. It was formerly known as Kaleidoscope, and it's really aimed at starting conversations early to help foster hope for people who've had spinal cord injuries and really set that scene that people can return to valued employment and it's all possible. And that's really quite a novel approach. We'll talk a little bit more about the kind of ad hoc nature of vocational rehab services across the world, but in particular New Zealand is leading that early component of vocational rehab services, which is excellent. So we wanted to know more about how it works. So the aims of the study are to understand how the service works and how the context in which it's provided impacts on return to work outcomes amongst people with spinal cord injuries, and then use this theoretical understanding to develop an implementation plan, as Rachelle mentioned, to be potentially trialled in people after stroke. So a wee bit of background. You probably all are very aware that work is really important. It's more than just something to pay the bills. And this picture depicts employment as a cycle of well-being and productivity, and really summarises how work has a kind of domino effect of positive psychological effects and increasing social support, and it's ultimately often very central to a person's identity. And United Nations identify it as a human right to be able to work. Getting a bit more specific about people with spinal cord injury and stroke and return to work statistics. So return to paid employment after spinal cord injury ranges from 21% to 67% internationally. Obviously that's quite a big range and represents the multitude of factors that are at play here in people's return to work, and often it's in a different role to what they were in prior to their injury. For both people who have had spinal cord injuries and stroke, it tends to have a better return to work rate if you're younger, if you're a Caucasian male with a higher education and income, and perhaps not surprisingly if you had a less severe event with higher functional independence. So a quarter of strokes occur in people of working age, and of course there's probably more than that as people tend to work older, and so it's not uncommon for us to see people in their late 60s, 70s continuing to work. And fewer than half of those resume work after stroke. And there's evidence that if you haven't returned to work within 2 years after stroke, then your return is less likely. Now, there's obviously some similarities between people who've had stroke and people who've had spinal cord injuries, but there's also some differences and some considerations. So, as I mentioned before, there's really a great variation and a lack of high quality evidence about what vocational rehab should look like internationally, and it really ends up being a postcode lottery. As Rachelle alluded to, the people after stroke, they're less likely to be receiving ACC funding, which has impacts in terms of how rehabilitation services are set up, but also in terms of funding that people might be receiving, particularly income funds and compensation. The number of people is anticipated to rise to 40% of having stroke over the next decade, which is rather scary, with an increase in incidence for younger adults and therefore increase in people who are likely to be working at the time of their stroke. On the positive, better treatments like clot retrieval and clot busting therapy means that there's an increasing number of people after stroke who are surviving what would have been a devastating stroke, but actually ending up dodging a bullet and going in quite a different trajectory and able to go back to work. So these two combined things mean that there's a much bigger population of people who are hoping to go back to work, and that there's a big area for us to optimise how we can support those people. Now, the average age of stroke onset for Māori is 61 years compared to 64 for Pacifica and over 75 years for New Zealand Europeans. Now, that's an old statistic, I'm afraid, but I would anticipate that the disparities are still the same in 2021. So, of course, it's more likely for somebody who's a Māori or Pacifica that they are of working age at the time of their stroke. And I just want to acknowledge some of the invisible effects. There's commonalities between spinal cord injury and stroke, particularly things like fatigue, pain, sensory changes, but some of the invisible effects which might be challenging for employment in stroke include cognitive changes, which may mean a different perspective is required in terms of vocational rehab. So, why is early vocational rehab important? Well, amongst the review documentation for both stroke and spinal cord injury and guidelines, there's a consensus that the longer someone's on sick leave, the less likely they are to return to work. That early vocational rehab can be effective and cost-effective in increasing return to work rates, so double tick there. There's strong evidence that structured vocational rehab interventions are effective between about a month and 6+ months, though the exact time limits remain unclear. A research question, I hear you thinking. And that there's evidence that having an early intervention inspires hope and enhances motivation. But, as I've already said, there's a lack of quality evidence of exactly what that looks like. I just want to make a signpost here for anyone who's particularly interested in the stroke side of work rehabilitation. There's a large multi-centre RCT going on at the moment in the UK that's looking at 20 stroke specialist centres and comparing early vocational rehab services with conventional vocational rehab care. And it's a study that's been going on for 4 years, due to finish at the end of this year. How much COVID will have affected that, I don't know, but watch this space, and I'm sure that will be interesting. Back to New Zealand though, as Rachelle mentioned, the Ministry of Social Development have made it a priority for us to have more and better employment services. So really investing to support people who want to work, and in particular services that have the flexibility to tailor their support and have a do-what-it-takes approach are known to be effective at supporting people with significant barriers to employment. So that's great. The stars have aligned, so it really gives us that ammunition and drive to explore it further. So this study's already been going on for a year and will continue for another year. And so far, there's been a realist review of the literature around early vocational rehab services. And from that, a theoretical framework's been developed. And this has been explored through interviews and surveys of people who've received early vocational rehab, both in Burwood and up in Auckland. And then there's been some focus groups exploring ideas with the people that provide early vocational rehab and wider stakeholders. So Rachelle is going to talk about the preliminary findings from last year.
Now, unfortunately, Jen couldn't make it today, and it's kind of her story to tell in many ways, but I've been given permission to give you a taster. I hope it's at a reasonable level that it's teasing for you to come and hear the details as we go through them. It's quite a big study, and there's lots of findings, so this is very much an overview, but if you've got specific questions, come and talk to us, because we're happy to, especially if it relates to your work context and things, and we're happy, really keen actually, for you to have a conversation with us, because that's what we're all about, changing practice. So as we've mentioned, that this is kind of some of the stuff that we've been doing, and the reason is, just to remind you, we really want to understand how it works. So just because we provide someone with a black box full of things does not mean that everyone's going to respond the same way, particularly if that black box is delivered in a completely different context where people have different clinical characteristics, but also the services are different and the funding systems are different, etc. So we need to sort of unpack the black box to explore what's in it and what it is that actually makes a difference for people and how they respond, so that when we put it into a new situation, we can make sure those key mechanisms, they're called, are still active, all right? So an example I hear from a realist thing is there was some work done, this is a realist is this type of research. They were doing some work in Australia, and they were looking at early support for health workers, nurses going into people's homes after they've had a baby, probably a bit like our old-fashioned plunket nurses that we had, and it made an amazing difference. So they thought, right, let's do that in Northern Territories. And of course it was an abject failure, because it wasn't a nurse going in, it was a person who I trust. And so in a new context, it's not exactly the same box that you deliver, you're trying to find who is it that makes the person respond in the same way. So we're trying to unpack that rather than describing who delivers it, how is it delivered, what is it that people are responding to. And the reason for that is because we're trying to develop this new system, this new program. So it's a research-based approach to developing an intervention that's more likely to work for more people and a range of people. Right, so as it's been alluded to, we did the realist review, which is basically a literature review, but we're really trying to understand how it works. So once again, unpacking that box, and there was 37 documents that were included in this review. Jen and Jono were the main people involved with that one. It's a whole paper, which is being developed. So this is very summary, but there's certain things that seem to be important. So if people are able to prioritise exploring work options within their current status. So as you can imagine, when you've just had a spinal cord injury or a stroke, it's pretty overwhelming. All right, so it seems to be really important that the person is able to prioritise it. No judgment attached to that, there is just, it's so awfully overwhelming. If return to work is discussed as an option, if it's just talked about as being an option, and if workplace support is given, then these outcomes seem to happen. People seem to have improved confidence in their ability to work. They seem to have improved psychological adjustment around being able to move towards a working situation. And they seem to be able to be engage in more solution-focused outcomes. The problem is, how do you get from here to here? What's in the middle bit? And there's some evidence in the research around what are the mechanisms that might be contributing to that. So there's evidence of fostering hope, exploring options, optimising self-efficacy, maintaining worker identity as people are undergoing their physical and psychological rehabilitation, etc., setting goals. So those things seem to be important. In terms of the connection or the relationship with the employer, staying connected to a workplace during that time seems to be important. Having an employer that's able to engage in those discussions of what the future might look like and what work might look like seems to be important. And the ability to have some flexibility around roles and what people might be able to do. The other thing that comes through is, does the wider rehabilitation team support the messaging of the early VOC rehab? So is there a synchronicity between what the early conversations are about and what the broader rehab team are talking about in the way they're setting goals and doing rehab planning? So those things seem to be important. But the literature has very little discussion, as you can imagine, because you've only got a few thousand words to write a very important paper. They don't really spend a lot of time describing the process of delivering early intervention. So we still don't have a lot of detail about what's the resource that's actually given to those people to sort of make these things happen, all right? So we needed to understand a bit more about that. So that's where the interviews with people following spinal cord injury who've had early intervention came in. We wanted to understand how people responded and at the same time do a little bit of work around mapping return to work journeys. So we did 30 interviews, and I'm really thankful for the lockdown because everyone was at home, and when I said, can I interview, they were like, please talk to me. So I had like 4 interviews a day for days on end, and it was fantastically efficient. So lovely, some amazing conversations over that time. Between 21 and 67 years of age, and 43% were involved in part-time or full-time employment at the time that they were interviewed. So it's quite a good mix. There's more details there, but just to give you an idea. I'm trying to come up with some creative paper way of writing this up, but at the moment I'm playing with a travel metaphor, and that sort of alludes to the types and the degree of wayfinding support that people need. To think about and to plan and action sort of their vocational intentions. So whenever we talk to anyone, and if I asked you, you'd say it's so different for everybody. It's just so complex, it's so different from everyone responds differently. And yet that's true, it's really true. But when you're trying to design an intervention, you've got to come up with something that you think is going to work for the most people. So you want to try and understand, are there certain groups that seem to respond better in certain situations to certain resources that are given to them? So that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to oversimplify it, but we're just trying to make it manageable, that complexity manageable, so we can start to think about it. And some key contexts that seem to be really important, that put people into different groups, was the amount of clarity that they had about their neurological or eventual functional status. So that level of clarity seemed to be quite important. You changed the way you delivered early intervention, and the way they responded was quite different if they had clarity, right? Or an emerging clarity, or no clarity, or etc. Their ability to return to the same employer in a same or similar role seemed to be really important, and that changed the way the things were provided and the way they responded. And interestingly, it became really clear that the degree of decision-making influence that they had within their workplace seemed to be absolutely crucial in terms of how much support they needed. There was a whole group of people that we said, did you need any support? And they said, no, I didn't need it, I did it all myself. And we might look at that and say, well, that's self-efficacy. But actually, it didn't appear to be about self-efficacy. It seemed to be about the amount of power or influence they had within the workplace to actually create flexible roles for themselves and to engage in discussions. So self-efficacy was part of it, but it seemed to also be important what the role was. So I won't go into in detail, but I've come up with this fancy-dancy sort of, for people that are really uncertain and lack clarity, you're sort of trying to create an Instagram feed of possibilities. You're trying to say this is possible, work is an option, here's an example. It's quite general, it's kind of just sort of out there. Then people that are looking like they can go back to the same employer in a similar role and have, they tend to go down this side. Some of them do their own online travel booking via the system. They did it all themselves. So they book their own travel, they work it all out, and they don't need a travel agent. Other people need a travel agent to give them a bit more support, to help them work out the systems and the processes, etc., etc. Both of these people that are looking like they might go back to work in the same or similar role and are moving this way do need support to check for travel alerts, and that's around, are you being realistic? Have you thought about your fatigue? Have you considered your morning routines? How's this going to work in terms of pain? What about this? So that sort of checking travel alerts needs to happen as well. And then the other groups on the other side are people who still have this is often people who have incomplete injuries. So have a very emerging picture, and so or they might have a lack of clarity, or they might just be really overwhelmed and need a complete change in their employer, and they're not quite sure where to go. Instead of Instagram, which is a bit more sort of general and here's a pretty picture, they start to curate some Pinterest boards that might work for me. So a Pinterest board's like an old-fashioned scrapbook. I had them for the royal family because I was into the royal family, don't judge me. One for Di and etc. But you had a scrapbook and it was about lots of topics around a more sort of distinct area of interest. So someone might be exploring this option, study option, retraining versus, changing my role from a field worker to a manager, or so you're starting to look at specific options, and then mapping out possible itineraries is once again coming down to a bit more detail about what does this look like, what's the next step once I've decided which way. So it's all a bit loose and it's just a concept, but it's that whole idea of there seem to be certain groupings, and the way that that's delivered seems to be a bit different for different people. The problem is that I was talking to people who were incredibly overwhelmed. They had so much going on, and then I was talking to them sometime down the period, down the track, and they couldn't really recall what exactly was talked about in those early conversations. And so their recall was quite limited. They go, oh yeah, it really helped because I did this. They know their response, but they can't really say what it was that was given, other than the obvious things of, I was told a story. They always remember the stories they were told, by the way. Tell a narrative. So we also did survey responses, so we want a broader group. So similar things, we wanted to map return to work pathways, and we wanted to sort of understand a little bit more. And that's been written up as well as a separate study, but was 37 responses, a few less than we were hoping for. But interestingly, they also found that those in more autonomous roles return to work faster. So that sort of supports some of the ideas that we were coming at. And participants highlighted the importance of feeling hopeful about return to work as a key mechanism, which comes out from the literature, supports what we found in the literature. But a couple of other mechanisms that kind of seemed to be a little bit more important was the benefits of fostering realistic expectations and opportunities to talk through options. So not just like knowing there's someone I can talk to about these things, it was important. Interestingly, the question that arises from that is what happens between the acute setting, when you're sustaining hopefulness and you're building up expectations, and then the long wait before community-based rehab might come in. So it's quite a long period. And that was an interesting thing that came up. So alongside all this, and actually before we did the realist literature review, we talked to the people who provide the EIVR. What do you do? Why do you do it? When would you do this? When would you do that? Etc. etc. So we've talked to them to try and understand that, and then we went back afterwards to sort of try and fill in the gaps. So where are we uncertain? So it's that ongoing to and fro with our experts. Interestingly, when we came back to filling in the gaps, the thing that was still really unclear about is to what extent and how does the wider rehab team support or not these early conversations, and how do the processes within the rehab service maybe support thinking about options and those sorts of things. So yeah. And then just to say, we've also done some talk to vocational providers who provide non-early rehab. So there are people who have supported people with spinal cord injury to get back to work, but further down the track. So we're kind of really keen to see, are there differences if people have had early intervention? To be fair, it was pretty hard to answer that question. We haven't done a full analysis yet, but we're still really, need to understand more about this. And I think that's going to be incredibly important, especially as we move into translating it into a stroke system as well. How do we link up services? We all know linkings and transitions are really, really difficult. And then we've also talked to people with lived experience of stroke, and also stroke vocational rehab providers, to sort of what do we need to consider as we move forward. Obviously it's really great having Emily now, who works in the stroke service, working with us, so that'll also help bridge that gap of understanding. So we're trying to understand the context of stroke services, current vocational rehab services for people following stroke, and how we might best recruit so we get a really good representative sample. There's still lots more work to do in that space, so don't worry if you haven't heard from us yet, and if you're keen to be part of it, we really want to hear from you. So yeah, so that's sort of the findings to date, and as you can see, and as I mentioned, we're trying to design the service, so we have to answer some of those questions. So these were sort of the two key questions that we really needed to understand. Voila, Emily.
Thank you. So, my mini study within the larger EVocS study is really all about going deeper and trying to answer some of those questions that were raised over the past year. We're really acknowledging that everybody and everyone's journey is different, but what are the key characteristics of early vocational rehab and how does it work in reality? Really trying to get those fresh conversations with people when it's happening and people really remember what's going on and how that changed things for them. So I am doing an observation study, which means I'm going to be a fly on the wall of sorts. So over the next 3 months, starting around March time, I am going to be working with the Burwood spinal unit, observing meetings related to early vocational rehab, and inviting people to participate, both people with lived experience but also the providers of vocational rehab and the wider team. And so looking at all components of rehab that might be related to their work, so it could be goal setting sessions, it could be pivotal therapy sessions that relate to work. And so I'm going to have my dictaphone and be making some wee discrete notes on these sessions, but also having interviews or discrete conversations depending on what's appropriate at the time. So some of these discussions will be just a kind of 5-minute catch up after a session or the next day, just so that I can ask some of those questions to go a bit deeper. So why did you make that decision, or what's going on and how's this changed things for you? Now originally we'd intended to limit that just to 4 people, but as we've had more conversations, we've realised that actually it might be useful to capture anybody during that 12-week period who is interested in participating, so that we can capture a broader range, but also acknowledging that it's going to be really different for where somebody's in their journey. So there might be some people that only have very limited conversations at that point, so by trying to capture more people, I can then focus a bit more on the people who are receiving pivotal vocational rehab input. Change your mind. So from this, it's going to generate lots of data which will be transcribed And we will then be using a realist approach, which Rachelle's already mentioned. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the realist approach, it's a qualitative approach developed by Ray Pawson, really emphasising the search for causative mechanisms that explain the social world. I can't emphasise this next point enough, that it's an explanatory rather than a judgmental focus. So my role being there is not to challenge why people are going things a certain way, or it's to know that it's a really good service, so it's understanding how it works. And it really looks to answer the how, why, the who, to what extent, and in what circumstances questions. So it's really helpful in making sense of interventions that are complex, such as early vocational rehab. Now, I want to just acknowledge that it can potentially feel a bit strange, that idea of having someone watching you. And a common first thought is, as soon as somebody's watching, particularly knowing that I'm going to be watching about work, it's going to change how services are delivered and the way that people are talking. And this is true, and that's also okay, that it's really common for us to reflect and consider the way that we do things all through different aspects of our lives, and as soon as you start thinking about it, it ultimately changes things slightly. But I do want to be careful to make sure that I'm not changing things to the detriment of the person who had a spinal cord injury, but also the wider team. So it's going to be really, really important to have regular discussions and reflections, and I really invite anybody who is participating in the study to keep talking with me about what's working and what's not working. The study, the approach I should say, is very much a dynamic approach based on what we're finding, but also the effects it might be having on the people participating. So people can consent to the study, but agree to only have certain components of sessions recorded or observed, and they can also, after the session, choose to withdraw their consent for that part, so I don't have to include all components of what I see. Similarly, some team members might prefer to not have me watching or collecting data on what they're providing, and that is fine. So it's all completely optional, and it's very much going to be a dynamic process. I also do want to acknowledge that, rightly or wrongly, when people enter into the hospital system as patients, it actually becomes really common to have conversations overheard. And as I say, it's not necessarily right, but people quickly become immune to having conversations overheard, be it being in a shared bedroom area or shared gym space, or having conversations in a corridor. That often, and speaking with people who've done observation studies, often it's not as big a deal as it might seem to the person in the centre. And there's a degree of people just getting used to having somebody in the room with you as well. So hopefully people will become a bit immune to the process as well. Okay, I think that probably leads on really nicely to us discussing, because you may well have some particular comments or ideas on how we can run the study and questions. So over to you. Digesting all the information.
Yeah. There's a high percentage of my Pacifica, as you said, the age is younger. Is there going to be data pulled out just on those, of the services are different or not for those groups?
Yeah, so we're certainly hoping that we will be able to capture the experience of Māori. It obviously depend on who's on the Burwood spinal unit at the time, but yeah, that's definitely something that's important.
And it's something that we're trying to pull out in all the various bits of the study. So the aim is to put that all together, all of what we've done so far, into one sort of overall theoretical understanding, and part of that will be exploring those differences. The other Pacifica in Auckland is there's a high number of Pacifica, and certainly I interviewed a number, and there does appear to be differences
So this conversation, you're doing your study based here,
Yes.
so that's the observational part is purely at the spinal.
Yeah, so not in
Okay.
Auckland.
Yeah.
Yes, we do logistics.
Yes, indeed.
There's strokes and there's strokes. Exclusion criteria.
So my study is just looking at the Burwood spinal unit. So the inclusion criteria is people over the age of 18 and that they were in employment at the time of their injury and that they're able to participate in English. But that will capture a broad range of people's different levels of spinal cord injury and experiences. But yes, you're right, stroke is similarly really diverse, and so that's why being able to really understand how the vocational services work early on is going to be really important, because it's not going to be a one size fits all. So understanding those intricacies will be really key.
To be fair, from a funder's perspective, MSD is probably going to look to see where they're going to get most bang for buck. So who is most likely to respond to an early intervention is probably one of the questions that they're going to want to know. And so we will be capturing, we want to include a wide range of people in our study so that we can start to give a bit of a steer on who seems to be responding most positively to their intervention, if it has to be targeted.
Yeah. Because I see that as a kind of complex question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the interesting thing is a lot of people think that stroke is really, really diverse, and obviously it is. What has been apparent to me as I've talked to people who experience spinal cord injury is that their experiences are incredibly diverse as well. And one of the responses we often hear is, but people who've had a stroke have got, cognitive problems. Well, a lot of people that I interviewed had clearly had some sort of traumatic brain injury at the time of their spinal cord injury, particularly those with cervical injuries, and were describing significant issues. I think I made sure 3 people got some expert opinion around concussion type symptoms that they were describing.
And it wasn't identified.
No. So there's complexity within the spinal cord injury population as well. So I think, it is complex across both. Yeah.
Nice work, team. Just a reflection, really. In the scoping review, literature review, things you put forward, and the interviews, the focus is clearly on, narrowing in on the key ingredients of the intervention, and what have their experiences been. What did they do, and did they find helped? And it's a really interesting idea to put it's like the responsibility for getting back to work is with the person who is most disadvantaged in this whole situation, the person who's had the injury or the stroke. And for any intervention like this, it seems like the elephant in the room is, what's the training for the employer, or the responsibility for society in general, but in particular the employer, to ensure a successful return to work? I think I don't appreciate you've got a scope that you can't sort of fix the whole world and things, but it'd be really easy for the Ministry of Social Development, ACC, to be honing in on the person with the disability, almost to take full responsibility for this working when, in fact they have rights, and they have limits to what they have power over. So autonomy seems to be a really key thing, and that's a employment situation or an employer attitude that enables them to have that autonomy, and the only one that can control that is the employer or employment law.
Yeah, great point, and it is outside our scope, unfortunately. However, it is something that's come into all of our various discussions, and we've had analysis that broader, our analysis meetings, that broader understanding of attitudes, behaviours, policies that support or not or incentivise employers or not to be good employers is part of those discussions. So we're trying to bring it in as much as we can, and it certainly comes up.
So is it fair to say that the scope of providers didn't include employers either? You didn't,
At this point, no.
The same, there was no MSD input either?
Yeah.
But if you think about it as a pipeline, you know, there's a system from someone's had something happen, and you know the end result, and there's these stages along here. This is, I see at this stage, all about that first stage. It's early intervention, so it's about instilling hope. It's about whatever it takes to get you to the second stage. But if you don't do the first stage, you don't even get to the second stage. That doesn't mean the second stage is less important, because once you hit that barrier, if the barrier becomes the employer and the modifications and attitudes and accommodations they're prepared to put in place, that's further down the chain. Yes, it's really important, but you know you can't eat the whole whale in one bite. So you chip away at the first part of the chain that's broken. You fix that bit, and then your next study or your next chunk of work can focus on further down the pipeline.
So the only exception to that, and Andrew, you are the expert, but the only exception I heard was that sometimes those early conversations would keep an employer willing to consider keeping it open, rather than saying it's gone and then you've got nothing to work with. So sometimes early can make sure that at least there's an ongoing conversation with an employer that can be held off a bit, but it's not a fait accompli.
Which also implies that you're going to help the employer to understand what they might be going through, because they would have had no perhaps idea.
And certainly that is something that is part of early intervention, is having those conversations with an employer. And those that do the online booking tend to do it themselves. Those who use a travel agent, the early intervention provider will do a lot of the conversations with the person's permission around what might be, what could work, etc., etc. So they're more of the broker, you might say, in that relationship. So that's quite a key difference that we noticed.
So your online bookers might not give the employer a chance to talk to somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah. So So there's a whole.
Your health literacy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Good to even think about this.
Yeah.
It just broadens your approach.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly do a bit of a plug, because we've got lots of clinicians here, and Emily did a great plug at the start, but we really want, because we want to do this integrated approach, we really want people to be part of our research processes in lots of different ways. So, you know, Emily's involved here, and you don't have to be a CDHB or DHB person to access that funds. That's open to any healthcare professional working for any employer. So, you know, come, chat. In fact, I think there's a April, maybe? Yeah. April application deadline, so come and chat with us. We've got ideas if you haven't got your own. So on this project, Emily's been involved here, and then we've had a number. Rachel McCaffrey, for instance, has been involved here already. We've had a whole range of different providers that have been working, healthcare professionals that have been working with us in the stakeholder. We're going to be actually designing the service, but once again, going to be bringing in people to help us make sense of it and make it real and make it work in the real world. We need support with dissemination, and then we also need clinicians to be coming up with research ideas. So, like I mentioned, this one didn't come necessarily from clinicians, although many clinicians identified it as an issue. But there are some that have come up that we've taken on. So I really just encourage you to come and chat with us and see the different ways that you can get involved. Obviously, Emily's got one pathway, but there's other ways that you can be involved. If you just want to dip your toe in the water, you can come and be involved in it, and less sort of take a year off and on a research holiday excursion. Come and join the adventure with us. So that's the references, if anyone's interested. Well, actually, I need to check. There might be some slides I'll remove, just so, because we have to publish and we can't have done it anywhere else and not get published. But we'll put up something that can be used. And Shah, can I get you to introduce a little bit about your vision for these groups?
Well, it's not mine. It's not my vision.
The strategic vision of that is going to be enacted by Shah.
Yes.
So this is Shah Davis, who has joined Bale relatively recently. She's been very glamorous today, and I don't think it's for us. I think you've got something other work related.
Oh no, I've been somewhere else, but it was also for you guys.
Okay, and Shah is supporting us with our amazing communications sort of area. So
Yeah, so we wanted to do a range of ways that people can access the peer support group. So we've obviously got in-house here, where we've got hopefully a couple of people who have been online here joining us. We've actually also been going live on Facebook for the first time today. So I've been watching it. At the most we had 3 people at one time. They would drop off and then maybe it was the same 3. Hello Facebook people. But we just want to have it as accessible for people as possible. We're also actually going to try online only as well. So our one for March will be online only. So we'll give you all the details of how you can actually access it, because we want people right across the country to be able to connect and participate. And so we will. The world, yeah.
World domination.
The whole world. The whole world will join us. Now there will be some times where we won't have it Facebook Live, and it will depend on what's being presented. But we will keep you all in touch with what's going on. As Rachelle said earlier, if you've got ideas of what you would like to hear, what you want to know more about or be discussed, please let us know, because our calendar is open. We're working on our calendar at the moment in terms of content. What we'll do is we'll send out the dates ASAP so you can lock those in for the year. But we're trying to get the calendar as set as possible before we give you a nice full, here are the dates and here are all the speakers. So just for your information for next month, it's the 11th of February, just the 11th of March. So 11th of March, and it will be online, but we will send you details and all that sort of thing as well. But the only other thing I have to say is thank you so much for coming. Please take a plate of cake on your way out, because we at the Bale team, as much as we love cake from the Cake Eating Company, who donated the cake for us today, we don't want to be eating it all. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you guys for your presentation. Very interesting, and I can't wait to see what the results are from what you guys, ladies, girls are studying. Yeah, so thank you.
thanks. And come and have a chat if you've got any questions, or email us. I'm really happy to connect if you want to have a chat over coffee. I'm always up for that. Yeah, I like coffee.